Okay, apologies for the abrupt ending on the previous video. As regular viewers of this channel know, the camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit after which I get cut off. One of these days I will get a better camera or get some editing equipment. I don't know, but for now I'm just stuck doing a second video. I actually had said almost everything I wanted to say in the first video. There's just one last thing I was going to talk about, and that's Tolstoy's view of history. So Tolstoy has this view of history that he's arguing through the book. And he intersperses his historical sections with little bits explaining his theories of history. But he usually limits himself to 1 or 2 pages at a time. Like I said before, he's not like Victor Hugo, where he goes off on 50-page digressions regularly. It's just 1 or 2 pages at a time, mostly throughout the book, except for the very end, and then he does go off on 40 pages at the very end. It's not something, if you hate these digressions, it's not something you need to worry about per se, except for 40 pages at the very end. But it is something interesting because it is a major theme of the book, is his view of history. So he's got a view of history, which I guess you would describe it as the opposite of the great man view of history. So the great man view of history would be that the War of 1812 was fought because Napoleon decided to invade Russia. Tolstoy's view is that there were just these historical currents that were rising. So that there was some kind of current bubbling that was going to cause a conflict between France and Russia. And it just so happened that Napoleon was the head of France at the time. But it could have been anybody. No matter who was in France at the time, there was some sort of conflict coming between France and Russia. Just historical currents had been bubbling, and it would have happened no matter who was in charge. So because this book is about the Napoleonic Wars is the example he keeps returning to over and over again, but he's of this view that kind of every major event in history, or every major war in history, we always read about the great men, but Tolstoy says, these were just the people who just happened to be there at the time. He said if it wasn't them, it would have been somebody else. So Napoleon is not so much a mover and shaker of history as he is a puppet of history in this view. Yeah, so it's a controversial view, to say the least. It definitely seems from a cursory reading of history that it was Napoleon's ambition that created that war, not a war that needed to happen regardless. It's also a view that a number of people who are in favor of the great man view of history take objection to. I mentioned this before in one of my previous reviews, but in the World Leaders Past and Present series, a series of which I reviewed several books, there's a historian, Arthur M. Schlesinger, has a foreword to this series in which he mentions Tolstoy's specifically. He says Tolstoy in War and Peace is advancing this view of history, and it's all wrong. And this is why actually it is people who shape history. I don't really have at this moment a strong view on which one is actually right, which is to say, it depends which mood you catch me in. There are some times when I'm more sympathetic to the great man view of history, and there are some times when I'm more sympathetic to Tolstoy's view. But what I will say is that Tolstoy is one of those writers where it's always interesting to see what he's thinking, whether or not you agree with him. And so even though I'm not entirely sure whether I agree with him or not, it was very interesting to see him make these arguments for his view of history in the book. It is a digression from the usual narrative, and it does go on for 40 pages at the end, but I didn't mind it. I actually found it quite interesting once I got into it. Okay, so that is the end of my review of War and Peace. Of course, there are a ton of other things I could talk about. The book is 1,441 pages long, but those are just all the things that struck me. Actually, no. You know what? I am going to talk about one more thing. And that thing being, I mentioned this at the top of my review. This is one of my old reviews from the blog that I wrote about 10 years ago. And I'm going through and looking at what I wrote 10 years ago and trying to make a video out of that. Just a bit of an epilogue, as it were. In the years since I've read this book, I've talked to several people who have also read it or who are currently reading it or who were currently reading it at the time I talked to them. And it was interesting to trade views with them. A lot of them had very similar experiences to what I did, where they were very confused by all the characters at the beginning, but it became clear enough once you got into it. They were surprised at how slow the plot was moving. You know, people expect War and Peace to be much more epic, right? You've got this title, War and Peace, and you think it's going to be this epic thing, and then, you know, you've got like 100 pages describing the party that all these characters are at and the conversations that they're having. Or you've got all these passages describing a winter retreat, and it's not what people expect when they read the book, and that throws people off. I've encountered some people who were frustrated by it, but the majority of people, I think, have had the similar reaction to mine, which is once you realize what kind of book you're in for, then you can actually enjoy it. The vast majority of people I talk to, almost all of them, have said that they really enjoyed this book. They were intimidated by it, many of them, but then they really enjoyed it once they got into it. And so I would give it that recommendation if you're considering whether or not to give it a try. Give it a try.